The purpose of this broadcast, if you want to call it a broadcast, is, or this video, is considering whether the American War for Independence, the Revolutionary War, whatever you want to call it, was justified or not. And a viewer asked me to talk about this. His name is Beer Cub. Beer Cub. He loves the Chicago Cubs. It's going to be hard to do this in 30 minutes, but I'm going to try to do it in 30 minutes. Okay, well, we know that the standard story in America, in the United States, is that the 13 colonies had to fight a war of independence to break away from the British Empire, which was so wicked towards them. Nice smoke. Wicked towards them and treating them bad. And they had to get their independence because the British were violating their rights and all that. We know that. We don't need to go into the whole history of it. Most people learn about it in grammar school. If you go to Canada or Great Britain, you're going to get a different viewpoint on it, which will be against what the American 13 colonies did. But let's try to look at it now. And I'd be interested to see what people say, you know, comments and whatnot. England, right? It started with England and with the Virginia colony in 1607. Then the French started Montreal, Quebec, not Montreal, sorry, Quebec in 1608. So we get Jamestown and then Virginia, and then, okay, so by 1733, they had 13 colonies because in 1733 was when the new colony of Georgia was started. Maine was part of the 13 colonies, but Maine was not its own colony. Maine was part of Massachusetts. It was a territory of Massachusetts until actually 1820. Plymouth Bay Colony and the Massachusetts colony used to be two separate colonies in the 1600s, but in 1691, they were combined into a single colony because it was more feasible. They would be united. It would be a little easier. Them, no argument there. The colony started slowly, went west. There were conflicts with the American Indians, and they had massacres on both sides. Whites treating Indians bad, Indians treating whites bad. We know that, all that story. Sometimes they got along fine. Some Indian tribes or nations, whatever you want to call them, a tribe is a nation. It's the same thing. They got along fine, never had conflicts, but in many cases they did. The colonists were generally happy to be English. They considered themselves English. They considered themselves English people in America. And then in 1707, Scotland and Great Britain were united into a single country, the Kingdom of Great Britain. So then they started using the term British people. Interchangeably, English people or British people, meaning English, Scottish, and Welsh, I guess you could say, and Irish. Generally, they got along. Now, here's where a lot of the problems came in, because the British and the Spanish and the French and all the other colonial powers, the Dutch, they had this system, mercantilism. And mercantilism was this idea that there was a limited amount of money in the world, and they didn't understand about wealth creation. So they thought that the only way a country could be strong was to have sort of a self-contained economy, where the British, mother country, England, would trade only with the colonies, and the colonies would only trade with the mother country, and it would be like this mutual beneficiary society where they would both enrich each other, like a commonwealth, which is what they call the British Empire today, the Commonwealth of Nations, a mutually like a mutual cooperative society of countries with a common heritage. The problem with mercantilism is that oftentimes you can get a better deal going to a competitor, maybe the Spanish Empire or the French Empire. But the laws, the trade laws said, no, you can only trade with Great Britain. Now, you could trade outside the empire with Spanish entities or French, but you'd have to pay a high fee, like these importation fees. And that's going to cause a lot of consternation with the colonists. So the colonists, now let's remember, the colonies were given their own legislatures by the British government. So the colonies all had their own legislatures, and which passed laws for the internal operations of the colonies. They had governors that were always appointed by the crown now, however. Usually they would appoint somebody that the American, like maybe in Connecticut, that the people in Connecticut would like or whatever. And then the legislature of the colony would pay the salary of the governor, which usually made the governor more likely to agree with the colonists, because he's going to get money from Virginia or Georgia or South Carolina, whatever. Okay. Everything generally was hunky-dory, but the colonists had a way of getting around these laws. Now, what I wanted to say was the colonists all took an oath of allegiance to the king. And by this time, it's the king and council. It's the king working in cooperation with the parliament. They work as a unit. It wasn't like the old days of Henry VIII and the Tudors, where the kings were virtual dictators. You had a cooperative agreement with the king and the parliament, which is still the case today, queen and parliament. All right. So they take an oath. They're going to do what they're going to be loyal to their sovereign. But the way they get around the importation laws is they just smuggle. So it was a widespread thing in the colonies that they would just smuggle items in. And Great Britain was very distracted with colonial wars around the world and European conflicts, wars of succession and all of this stuff. So in the 1600s and 1700s, they generally, they knew it was going on, the smuggling. They had laws on the books, but they sort of allowed it to go on. Like, the laws were not really enforced too much, just let it happen. Okay, so the colonists would, on the one hand, say we're going to follow the law. On the other hand, they just wouldn't follow the law. And if they had inspectors that would come make sure they weren't smuggling, those people get paid off, money in their pockets, so nobody is wiser, right? Okay, here's where the trouble really came about, because you had these major colonial wars. King William's War in the 1690s, Queen Anne's War in the early 1700s, King George's War in the 1740s, and then the big war in the 1750s to 1760s, the 7 Years' War in America, called the French and Indian War. Mainly conflicts between Great Britain and its allies versus France and her allies. That junk was going on forever. All right. I mean, France and Great Britain always had to fight over everything. I mean, who ever heard of cooperating, right? I mean, that would be cheap. You just cooperate. You have your territory, I'll have mine, and you could save a lot of money. But no, these Great Britain and France, these countries are so greedy, or they're going to fight over every bit of land. So France had their huge empire, Louisiana, which used to stretch from practically where Pittsburgh is today all the way out to Idaho. And then New France, which was the big middle part of Canada. And Acadia, which is Nova Scotia today. But they just, these countries always think they're going to win, right? So they're going to fight it out. We're going to fight it out. But France was always a little bit weaker. So they generally lost the wars. They lost King William's War, Queen Anne's War, King George's War, and then France always lose more territory. But they figured the next round, we're going to get them back. So then the big showdown came in 1758. France and Great Britain go to town again. I mean, they go to war again, toe to toe. I mean, they're really going at it this time. And this is like for all the marbles. And they're fighting in Europe over some other issues, the 7 Years' War. So they are going at it. Everybody, it's like a worldwide conflict. They fight in India, they fight in America, South America, the Caribbean, everywhere, Europe. At first, France got the jump on the British, so they were winning at first. But like has been going on for 400 years in history, the British slowly got control of the situation and took command of the war and started kicking their, you know what. So France was getting their tail whipped bad. Spain was getting, you know, tore up bad. So back in those days, they didn't fight till they crushed the opponent. They would just call it off, say, time out, let's have a meeting. And they had the meeting in Paris, and the French said, okay, fine, we cry uncle. And France had to give up all kind of territory to the British because they got beat so bad. So France had to give up all of Canada except for 2 little islands, which they still own today, Saint Pierre and Miquelon, for mainly to deal with fishing, French fishing interest in America. So most people don't even know that France still owns 2 island territories next to Canada. They're so obscure today. They lost. They knew the British were going to take it. They knew the British were going to take it, right? So they just gave Louisiana to Spain. And then the Spanish ended up in a trade-off, gave Florida to the British. And back then, Florida used to stretch from Baton Rouge all the way. That's how big Florida used to be. And they had some other territorial adjustments in the Caribbean and Europe and all of that. Okay, here's where the trouble came. I mean, the real trouble. Everybody in America was happy to be British. They always volunteered to go fight on the side of Great Britain against France in those 4 wars. They volunteered. No, they didn't have a draft back then, so they just signed up because they wanted to get control of Canada, and they did. Okay. Yay. Now the British, this was the most expensive war Great Britain had ever fought. It was the most expensive war in history up to this time. So now they got this huge debt, and the British government said, we got to pay this debt off, and they're trying to figure out ways to pay the debt. So they said, well, okay, well, we're going to put some taxes on America, and this time the Americans are going to pay. I mean, they always get away with, they don't pay any fees or anything because they just ignore the law. So they said, you're going to have to pay the stamp tax. They passed a Stamp Act. And when you have a high school diploma or a wedding, you know, a marriage or a law degree, all these different things, you'll have to buy a 1 penny stamp and have it attached. Just like today, when people buy cigarettes, there's a cigarette stamp. And today, people don't even care about the taxes today. And today, Americans, about half their salary is taken up in taxes. About half the money you make, the government seizes in taxes. So back then, in 1765, the British are saying, we want to take about 1,000, you know, 1,000% of your money in taxes every year. And it's a pay for use tax. In other words, you wouldn't even pay the tax unless you bought these items, right? That it's not an income tax. It's not a property tax. And the British thought, this is fair. We pay pretty high taxes in England, and Americans really don't pay any taxes, hardly, you know, so they should not mind. Oh, all of a sudden, there was this huge uproar across the colonies, and it was organized by these organizers. We're not going to pay the stamp tax. And the British were caught off guard. They just couldn't understand it. Like, what's wrong with you? It's a nominal tax. It's a meaningless tax. And the Americans said, no, if we let you tax us, then you'll start putting more and more taxes on us, external taxes, and then we'll lose our independence completely, and we'll just be little you know, puppets of you. And the British said, that's ridiculous. We just want you to pay these taxes. We have to pay the war off. Plus, they always had these conflicts with the Indians, right? So the British were tired of that. And they decided that until further notice, the Appalachian Mountains would be the border, and no one could go past the Appalachians into the new territories until all that was organized, because they didn't want this big Indian war to break out. So they told the Americans, until further notice, they really wanted to go in there and survey and try to make treaties with the Indians and all of that. They wanted an ordered settlement of the West. And back then, the West meant Kentucky and Tennessee, okay? Oh, they were in an uproar. The Americans say, no, no, they're trying to keep us from getting the land we fought and died for, even though most of the people that fought and died in the Indian War, the French and Indian War, were English from Great Britain. No, no, no. And the British attitude was, you idiots, we're not telling you you can't go in the land forever. We're saying for now, for further notice, until further notice. But they said, no, no, it's terrible. So there was this huge uproar and all the civil disobedience and outright violence against stamp collectors and everything, threatening them. These organizers, today we might call them terrorists, these organizers say, if you open that stamp office, who knows what could happen to you? Well, you might even get killed or whatever, you know, these implied threats. So it was such an uproar that the British said, well, okay, we're going to repeal the Stamp Act. They repealed it, 1766. Fine, we're repealing the Stamp Act. But they didn't like the attitude of the colonists that they're going to, on the one hand, say we're loyal to Great Britain and the king, but on the other hand, we'll just revolt anytime you pass a law we don't like. Based on precedents that we're just creating. We're just saying, you can't make an external tax. We're just making this precedent. Well, there was never any precedent set. You're a colony, you're part of Great Britain. The British did not view it as external, internal. It's all one country. It's Great Britain, Virginia, Connecticut, Georgia, South Carolina. It's all one country. The country's called the British Empire. It's one single country with one king. You didn't have to use a passport to go from any part of the realm to another, so they don't understand. They're thinking, what do you mean external? It's all one country. So that's their attitude. Like, what is the trip of these American colonists? But the British were very suspicious, and they thought, we know what the trip is. Their trip is that they're trying to break away and set up their own country. I mean, that's kind of obvious. So when they passed the Stamp Act, they passed another law along with it that said, by the way, any future laws that we choose to pass, the colonies can be held under that law for any reason. In other words, we can make the colonists follow whatever law we want to. So the British were very suspicious that they were going to have a group of people that were going to revolt. Most Americans were probably indifferent either way. They just wanted to live their lives. You had a small group that probably did want to break away. You had another group that wanted to stay loyal at all costs. They were super patriots. Then you had the middle third, who probably just didn't want any trouble to break out. But it's that 1/3 that wants to break away that can cause the trouble, right? Just like in Ireland, Northern Ireland, it was a small group of rebellious people that made chaos for everybody. Now, the British suspect something's going on, and so they slowly started sending troops to America. So the Americans see all these British troops arriving. Like, what's going on? The French and Indian War is over. There are no foreign enemies that can attack us, except the Indians, which that could be handled anyway. The French are gone. The Spanish are on the periphery, and they're not even, Spain was not a strong country by this time. It's pretty obvious why the British were sending troops in. They were sending troops in to guard America in case there was an uprising against the crown. And so there was all kind of like controversies that were breaking out all the time. We had the famous Boston so-called massacre in 1770, where the way the Americans portrayed it like there was these nice people just peacefully protesting against the British tyranny, and the British soldiers, for no reason, just shot into the crowd and killed a bunch of people, which in fact was totally the opposite of the truth. You had British soldiers guarding the courthouse, and these American troublemakers showed up and tried to attack them and bait them and insult them and hurt them. And so they started throwing rocks and bricks and everything at them, and they opened fire, and some people were killed. It was no massacre, and it wasn't even intended to be a massacre. It was just used as propaganda. Oh, the British are a bunch of killers. So that started to work on, you know, a lot of people are ignorant. They don't know anything, and they don't study. So some Americans were influenced by this. Oh, the British are trying to hurt us some kind of way. And the British attitude was, I don't know, you know, that they were not, you know, the King George III. It was George II at first, and now George III, the House of Hanover, which is still the British family in control today, really. They call it the House of Windsor, but it's really Hanover. All right. Or Saxe-Coburg-Gotha through marriage. But they don't understand, because the British are thinking, they're part of this great empire. We could be strong around the world. Why do they want to, what's the purpose of making the trouble? So they always had this income revenue problems. So in the 1770s, they passed the Townshend Acts and these other acts to try to raise revenue again. And there was another round of uproar. The British are trying to violate our rights. No taxation without representation. You know, the old, you've heard that before. We need to be represented in Parliament. And the British say, not really. That's just a rule you're making up. You have your own legislatures. And then violence, real violence started to break out. There was a ship off the East Coast that was burned, sabotaged and burned, full of supplies. And then we had the Boston Tea Party in 73, where a British, that was the Tea Act, just a little nominal tax on tea. And the Americans said it was a great conspiracy to violate Americans' right, because they had to pay this nominal tax on tea, right? You know, this. It would make it to where you wouldn't be able to buy one gumball a year. So ransacked the ship and threw all the tea in the harbor and said to the British, here's the middle finger. What are you going to do about that? What are you going to do about that? You know, the British are funny people. They drink tea and they wear shorts, you know, funny looking shorts and high socks, and say, oh dear, and all those things. But if you screw with them too much, they get crazy on you. But they'll do it in a very measured way. I mean, they'll kill you and burn your house down, but they'll do it while they're drinking sherry and smoking very fine tobacco. So Hitler found this out. He thought he was messing with a bunch of pansies. He found out he was messing with a very savage group of people that just had a very an eloquence about them. They had a nice way of carrying themselves, let's say. So the British said, okay, old boys, you destroyed all that tea. We got a solution. So the British Parliament says, not a problem. Boston Harbor is closed until every dollar or every pound of that tea is paid for. And the British Navy showed up and put a blockade on that harbor. So the British will always, they'll up the ante on you. You want to get this crazy. They don't get loud. They don't get excited. They'll just say, okay, let's get this crazy. And if you want to get this crazy, they'll get this crazy. So then a whole lot of troops started showing up. And then we know the whole story. The Americans organized and they had the First Continental Congress, and they said, here's the list of demands. You know, they're like Martin Luther in 1517. Here's our demands. You're going to do this. George III was a kind of a kind-hearted person. He was an unusual type king. His hobby was basically running the government. That's what he was interested in. He wasn't one of these philanderers that left the run after women. He was loyal to his wife, Queen Charlotte, and his children. And he was very hurt. You know, he couldn't understand why these colonists wanted to revolt. But on the other hand, he was angry too. And he had a little temper problem. And if you wanted to get, you know, ignorant, as we would say on the streets, you want to get ignorant, he can get real ignorant too. So he was not one to back down from a challenge. So when the Americans presented this list of demands to him, you know, here's the king, here's a group of people saying, we pledge our life, our loyalty to our sovereign, the king. And, you know, they would pledge a solemn oath now, but yet on the other hand, we'll just revolt whenever we don't like what you're doing. So he took that very personally, and so did the British Parliament. They say, no, this is not going to go down like this. So lots of British, you know, the British attitude was, no, you're not going to give us demands. We got a better solution. We're going to send in troops. If you want to have it out like that, we can have it out like that. It's not a problem. We might lose, but it ain't a problem. So then we know the next story. The Americans are stockpiling weapons. And now the way it's portrayed today is that the British just came over here to seize weapons because they didn't believe in the right to bear arms. That's ridiculous, because all Americans owned weapons at the time. Personal ownership of weapons was universal. There were no gun control laws, so everybody could have weapons. But they were stockpiling weapons for a revolt. I mean, a child could figure this out. The British knew where the stockpile was. They had informants everywhere. I mean, British intelligence, the British intelligence service is the best on earth. Okay, they can tell you what you're going to eat for breakfast before you get served. So they knew where the stockpile was. So they would go and get the weapons. The Americans found out, and we know they were there to stop them. And the battles of Lexington and Concord broke out in 1775. And then, so now here's the American soldiers who have pledged an oath of loyalty to their sovereign, the King George III of the House of Hanover, but yet they're firing on his troops. Let's say the police come today to seize weapons. They claim that you have weapons. The smart thing to do would be to go along with them, and if you get arrested, you hash it out in court. You go to court. They say you're under arrest, you go along. That's the rule. You go with the police and you hash it out in court. But let's say the police show up today at your home and they say you have weapons, but you're going to stand out there on the porch with your friends and you're going to fight it out. I can pretty much assure you that it ain't going to go down in a peaceful way, and that a whole lot of cops are going to show up and your house is going to get fired on. And everybody in the house is going to get killed. There's no doubt about that. So when these loyal colonists, they're pledging loyalty to the king. They're openly pledging loyalty to the king. When they fire on his troops, that's when George III, he flipped out and he told the parliament, that's it. He figured most Americans were loyal to the king. And in fact, maybe most Americans were. There were 1/3, we got to remember this, 1/3 of the Americans were loyal, and they fought for their king, or in their view, for their country. Now, the Americans then said, well, look, here's our olive branch petition. The war's already started. They've already fired and killed British soldiers, but we're going to give you a petition. If you give in to these demands, these whatever, how many demands it was, which basically said, if you give us self-government, and we'll still have the crown as a symbol, but we're going to do what we want. Today we would call that not really dominion status, because dominion status, like Canada got in 1867, you were still a colony. We're talking about realm status, like today, where you are almost 100% independent. Canada today is independent in almost every way. Of course, there is a connection to the crown, but we'll get into that later. The Queen is the Queen of Canada today still, and the Queen is the Queen of each of the Canadian provinces. She's the Queen of Manitoba. And in fact, the governor of Manitoba reports to the Queen, to the lieutenant governor, excuse me. In Australia, they call them governors. They report to the Queen. But anyway, we'll get off of that. Now, but that's the way they wanted it. The crown will be a symbol, but we'll do what we want. And George III said, oh, no. When they presented that olive branch petition to him, he basically said, get that out of my face. Uh-oh, a wreck. Always praying for the people that I think they're hurt. I hope they're okay. Now, so his attitude was, if they mean to have war, then let's do it. He was not a person that was going to punk out. So let's do it. Let's go at it. If we lose, we lose. I don't care. We're going at it. So the British attacked. The Americans fought back. At first, the Americans weren't doing too well, but the British were not exactly prepared for a war in the colonies. They were very overconfident. They were not fighting on their home turf. But the main reason is that there's France and Spain and the Netherlands, they're old enemies waiting in the wings, looking for this opportunity, very happy to jump in and help the Americans. So the Americans were very happy to receive assistance from the French and the Dutch and the Spanish, which is ironic because they used to enjoy killing the Dutch, Spanish, and the French, who they claim to hate, their mortal enemies against the crown. But now they're willing to accept aid from them to fight against the king who a month before they had pledged allegiance to. So You know, I can get into a lot of trouble making this video. Like people will say you don't like America, and it's nothing like that. I mean, I live in America now. It's here. This is the situation at hand. We know the British lost because everybody jumped in. It was like a gang jump in. The Americans were fighting, and the French, the Spanish, and the Dutch jumped in. And when they're getting kicked that bad, the British said, all right, screw it. You know, you want to go independent, go independent. 1783, they did sign the Treaty of Paris, and the Americans became an independent country, and the British recognized that. They thought it was stupid. It was unnecessary. So the question people ask me is, do you think the war was justified? And my answer is no, I do not think the war was justified, because if they had just, let's say, gone along with these nominal taxes, I mean, very low. History shows us that in time, the British would have allowed these colonies to become self-governing countries anyway. They did the same thing with Canada. They organized Canada into a united country, the different colonies, and over time, Canada became self-governing. In 1982, Canada was granted their own constitution. So for 32 years, Canada has controlled their internal affairs completely. I mean, of course, the Queen is still involved, but she's involved as the Queen of Canada, not as the Queen of Great Britain now. She's the Queen of 16 separate countries, in fact. That's a little complicated, but we'll get into that later. But if we ever get into it, but so basically they fought this great war of independence to get independence that they would have gotten anyway. So what would be the difference today if they hadn't had the war of independence? Okay, instead of being an independent country today, if we wouldn't have had the war of independence, we would just be an independent country today. But then the post office would have Queen Elizabeth's picture hanging up in it, and those little stamps you get at the post office would have a crown on it. Big deal, right? And the cops would have a crown on their little cap instead of a star or whatever. And people might eat more chutney, and we might call potato chips crisps, but it wouldn't really be much difference, except that a whole lot of people wouldn't have been killed. And the flag would be different. Still be red, white, and blue, right, today. Might have stripes, but be a little different design. Instead of Louisiana State University, it might be Louisiana Royal University, but otherwise wouldn't make much difference. So like most wars, they're unnecessary, in my opinion, and a lot of people die, and a lot of property is destroyed for virtually no reason. Well, I'd be curious to see what you say about this. Thank you for watching this video production.